Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's been happening in the Chinese economy, and specifically to talk to you about Evergrande. Now, up until now, Evergrande, the property developer, has been famous as being the company with the most debt in the world, over $330 billion, which is absolutely astronomical. And if you follow the channel, you'll be aware that Evergrande is now in liquidation. A Hong Kong court recently ruled that the company didn't have enough assets or cash to be able to meet all of its liabilities, and so it's now going through a liquidation process. And it's highly likely that the investors in Evergrande are going to lose hundreds of billions of dollars. So this is probably going to be the biggest losses that have ever been encountered for a single company. But what we're now hearing from China is that Evergrande might not be remembered as being the company with the biggest losses. It might actually be remembered as the company that was the biggest fraud in history, because the regulators in China have accused Evergrande of fabricating their accounts by $78 billion by including revenue that wasn't real revenue. And they fined the company 4 billion Chinese yuan, and there's an investigation going on right now. And if this is proven to be correct, then Evergrande will be a bigger fraud than Enron, Bernie Madoff and WorldCom. It will go straight to number one in the charts. And the big question is this issue just contained to Evergrande? Because Evergrande have basically been including in their sales all sales that were pre-sales. So basically when a customer walked in and reserved an apartment before it was built, they were including that sale in their numbers. But obviously they hadn't actually been through the build process, they hadn't got through all the costs, so they shouldn't have been doing that. And if every other property developer in China has been following this same methodology, this could be one of the biggest Ponzi schemes that we have ever seen, because these companies will be much smaller than they've been showing in their accounts. And one of the really interesting things about this case is that Evergrande's auditor is PricewaterhouseCoopers, the second largest accountancy firm in the world. And if you followed what happened with Enron, Arthur Andersen, who were the accountants for that company, actually went bust. The company had to stop practicing because it was hit with a whole lot of criminal charges and its license was taken away. So right now there are a lot of people feeling very nervous about this situation, not least the founder and former chairman of Evergrande, who's currently under house arrest. So in today's video, we'll go through the details of the accusations that have been made by the Chinese regulator against Evergrande. We'll then talk about what the implications of this are for the founder of Evergrande and the Chinese property sector. We'll then have a look at where this ranks in terms of the history of world frauds. We'll then have a look at what's happening right now in the property market in China, because there are still major problems. And I'm sure you'll be aware that property equates to around 25% of Chinese GDP. So this is really important for the Chinese economy. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think is likely to happen in this case, and what the implications will be for the wider property market and the Chinese economy. But before we get started on all of that, I'd like to say thank you so much to everyone that's supporting the channel. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks over the last week or so, thank you so much for the time and effort that you've taken to do that. Really appreciate it. And if you've signed up as a long-term supporter, either through Patreon, YouTube memberships, or Buy Me a Coffee membership, thank you so much for your long-term support. Really appreciate it, and it helps me making more videos. And one thing I'd like to talk to you about in today's video is the possibility of winning this guy. Stiltman has been one of my favourite statues. It's appeared in lots and lots of videos after the last few years, but I've decided to offer it up as a prize. So if you're interested in winning this guy, then check out the video at the end of today's video and have a look in the link below. The China Securities Regulatory Commission has accused Evergrande of inflating its financial results for 2019 and 2020 by a total of $78 billion and hit the company with a fine in excess of 4 billion Chinese yuan, which equates to around $580 million. The nation's top securities regulator said the developer's onshore unit inflated revenue by recognising sales in advance in the 2 years through 2020 that led up to its default, and has imposed a fine of 4.18 billion yuan against the company. Evergrande's alleged fraud dwarfs that of Chinese company Luckin Coffee Inc. and deals a blow to both the reputation of its former auditor, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and China's financial oversight. It fuels concerns about how widespread such accounting issues are, just as the new China Securities Regulatory Commission chairman is trying to tighten oversight. The fine that's imposed also means Evergrande, with about $332 billion in liabilities, will have even less money to pay off global creditors, despite a Hong Kong court ordering the company to be liquidated in late January. The regulatory action comes as China continues to grapple with a property downturn that has eroded economic growth and household wealth, as home sales and prices tumble. Evergrande used to recognise revenue from apartments, including those that were pre-sold but yet to be delivered. The developer said last year that it had changed its approach since 2021 to book revenue after units were completed or occupied by their owners. China's regulators alleged that Evergrande's founder, Hui Ka-yan, instructed company personnel to falsely inflate annual results. The onshore unit, Hengda Real Estate Group, boosted its 2019 revenue by around 214 billion yuan and another 350 billion in 2020, the regulator said. And these inflated figures accounted for half of total revenue in 2019 and 79% in 2020. The regulator has also accused the founder of Evergrande of using these inflated figures to market a combined 21 billion yuan in bonds. Evergrande's founder was fined 47 million yuan, or around $7 million, for the falsified results and other alleged violations, and banned for life from capital markets activities. Other former executives were also among people punished with fines and market bans. Hengda's auditor in 2019 and 2020 was PricewaterhouseCoopers Zhongtian LLP, a Chinese mainland entity affiliated with PwC's network. PwC resigned as Evergrande's auditor in January 2023 due to audit disagreements. PwC has also resigned as auditors for other Chinese developers, including Sunac China Holdings and Shimao Group Holdings in Hong Kong. The Financial Reporting Council said in 2022 that it was looking into Evergrande's financial statements for 2020 and expanding an investigation of an audit carried out by PwC. So what do the allegations of falsifying their accounts in 2019 and 2020 mean in terms of the likely outcome of the current liquidation of Evergrande? Well, the company was placed into liquidation proceedings in January by a Hong Kong court. And one of the problems that all of the investors have is that the jurisdiction of Hong Kong doesn't really travel into mainland China. Obviously, the Hong Kong courts can say that the company has to be liquidated. However, China and the regulators have to agree if they're going to allow access to any of the mainland assets. And realistically, all of the assets in mainland China are secured against Chinese debt provided by Chinese banks. So from an investor's point of view, the only way of recovering any real value will be by liquidating all of the overseas assets. And in terms of the $332 billion of debt that the company has, a very small proportion relates to assets overseas. So realistically, the investors are looking at a complete write-off. We've talked about this before. When you go through a liquidation process, you have to appoint accountants. So normally a company like PricewaterhouseCoopers, but I doubt very much that they'll have any involvement given the fact that they're now under the microscope in terms of signing off on those fraudulent accounts. I'm sure there'll be quite a lot of worried partners sitting at PwC right now trying to work out exactly what went on and whether or not they are liable for any of this. But in terms of the liquidation process, an accountant would be appointed. They will then be in charge of running that particular unit or that particular company and trying to recover as much money as possible to give back to the investors. And that might be through a process of either selling all of the assets or even carrying on trading. So if you've got a situation where you've got an apartment building that's semi-built, it might actually make sense to invest more money into completing those apartments so that you can then sell them, realise all of the cash and give that to investors. But the problem that you've got when you're looking at Evergrande is that they've been accounting for things that were pre-sold. So they were selling these apartments in advance to consumers in China and elsewhere, and then booking that full sale through their accounts in that year before they'd even started building it. And you don't have to be an expert in accounting to know that that doesn't make sense. You shouldn't be booking a sale before you've even started to build the product itself. So obviously there are major problems, but in terms of the recovery from the investor's point of view, they're probably not going to get anything anyway. So does this make any difference? What are the implications of these fraudulent activities? Well, I think the implications are absolutely huge, not just for the liquidation process, but also for the reputation of Chinese developers. Because if it comes to light that all of the developers were following this practice, maybe somebody in China came up with the idea, maybe it was a loophole in the way that their wording was in terms of how you account for sales in this sector. We don't really know why Evergrande did it, but if there's a possibility that other developers in China were also doing this, then this could have huge implications for the whole sector, because what it means is that all of those accounts will be overstated. The profitability and the turnover of these companies will be hugely inflated and fabricated. And so these companies will actually be much smaller than they've made out to be. And what that means is that the level of debt that those companies should have been taking on also should have been much smaller. So basically, by inflating your numbers, it means that you can borrow more, take on more debt, which obviously fuels more expansion and the starting of more projects and more pre-sales. And so this could be a huge Ponzi scheme, because basically you're telling people that you're much bigger than you are. They're giving you debt in exchange for that information, and you're then saying you're getting even bigger because you've got more debt, you can start more projects. And therefore the implications of this for the property sector in China is that the whole sector could be a house of cards. It could have been built on false information. And if that's correct, then that means that we're going to see widespread losses all across the board. If all of these companies have been overstating their figures, then basically they've got more debt than they can handle. So that means that we're facing huge losses in terms of all of that debt. And that is going to have a massive impact on the Chinese economy, because 25% of the Chinese economy is based upon property. So the implications of this potential fraud are huge in terms of the property sector and the Chinese economy. But they're also very serious in terms of Evergrande's founder, Hui Ka-yan, because if he's found guilty of falsifying those accounts and committing fraud, he is potentially liable to be arrested. And when you look at what's happened to other major businessmen in these situations in China, there is a potential that he's now facing either life imprisonment or potentially the death penalty. The former chairman of China Life Insurance, Wang Bin, was recently found guilty of taking $44 million in bribes and was sentenced to death, but currently has a 2-year reprieve and is hoping that the sentence will be commuted to life in prison without parole. He's the latest boss from a major Chinese financial institution to be ensnared in President Jinping's 2-year-long crackdown on corruption in the financial industry. The former chairman of Hurong, one of China's largest state-controlled asset management companies, was executed after being found guilty of corruption and bigamy. The same year, former China Development Bank chairman Hu Hebang was sentenced to life in prison in an 85 million yuan bribery case. So as I mentioned at the start of today's video, if it's proven that Evergrande has fabricated its accounts by $78 billion, which is a massive number, it would make Evergrande the largest fraud in the history of all financial fraud. This goes straight to number one. Now, in terms of looking at the issue of fabricating your sales, basically inflating your numbers to make your company look bigger than it actually is, the Evergrande situation is by far the largest that we have ever come across. And this graphic compares the relative size of the $78 billion of inflated sales for Evergrande against 3 other major cases in history. And if you're interested in financial frauds, this is something I actually covered on the channel a long time ago. I did a series on financial frauds and actually did an individual video on all 3 of the companies shown here. The second largest case of inflating your sales was a US telecommunications company called WorldCom that basically acquired lots of other businesses and then fabricated all of their numbers to the tune of $11 billion, which is obviously absolutely huge, but Evergrande is more than 7 times bigger than that. Enron, which was a USA energy trading business, and up until this point is the largest fraud in history, only fabricated their sales by a mere 600 million, which compared to 78 billion is a drop in the bucket. And Luckin Coffee was a startup coffee chain in China, similar to Starbucks, that listed its shares on the US stock markets and overstated its sales by $310 million. So in terms of fabricating its figures, Evergrande is streets ahead of all of its competition in terms of the largest frauds in history. But what about the potential losses? Well, up until now, the biggest single losses that have been encountered as a result of fraud are Enron, where investors lost around $74 billion, WorldCom, where they also lost around $74 billion, and the Bernie Madoff scandal. And Bernie Madoff was an entrepreneurial investor who raised a fund that was unbeatable in terms of its returns. And the reason that it was unbeatable was because it was a Ponzi scheme. He wasn't actually investing into anything. He was just taking money off one guy and giving it to another guy as dividends and making out that his fund was doing extremely well. And the investors in the Bernie Madoff scandal lost $65 billion. So what's the potential for the investors to lose in terms of the Evergrande situation? Well, obviously, we've got $332 billion of debt at play here, and it really depends on what the returns on that will be. But there is a very good chance that investors, including the banks in China, will lose significantly more than $74 billion. We could be talking 100, 200 million. We could even be talking a full write-off of the $332 billion. So not only does Evergrande have the chance of being the largest fraud in history, it also has the chance of being the biggest losses encountered as a result of that fraud. However, because a lot of that debt is held by Chinese banks that are ultimately owned by the Chinese state, it's unlikely that we will ever hear about those huge losses. I don't think China will be publishing that information. We may well hear that all of the overseas debt of Evergrande goes down, but that's only around $22 billion. So it won't rank in terms of the largest losses ever. But in reality, the real losses are probably going to be more than $100 billion, making it the worst case in history. Now, in terms of checking out what's going on in the property sector right now, things are still looking extremely bad in terms of what's going on for the Chinese property developers. This chart shows the monthly movement in new build house prices in China, and new build house prices are the key metric because everybody in China wants to buy new. The secondary market is very small. Around 95% of all property transactions are new builds. And what this chart shows is that in 10 out of the last 12 months, property prices have fallen. And the only 2 months where there have been any signs of positive movement were May, when prices rose by 0.1%, and June, when they rose by a fraction above 0%. And if we look at what's been happening over the last 4 months, you can see that the situation has been getting progressively worse. In November, prices fell by 0.2%. In December, 0.4%, in January, 0.7%, and in February, the year-on-year fall in house prices was 1.4%. And if we expand the chart out to show what's been happening over the last 5 years, you can see that there is a significant downward trend over that period. Things have been going wrong in the Chinese property market for a long period of time. And one of the other concerns from China's point of view is the year-on-year compounding of these price falls. Because the data that we're looking at for February 2024, the negative fall of 1.4%, is actually a comparison against what happened in February 2023, when prices also fell by 1.2%. So you've got a fall measured against a previous fall. So in real terms, prices are plummeting in China right now. And obviously from the developer's point of view, that is an absolute nightmare because these companies need to be raking in as much cash as possible. And the problem that they've got is that it takes a long period of time to actually build these apartments. And if prices are continually falling, then that means that you're pulling in less cash when you actually get to complete the sale of these properties. And therefore, it's causing them even bigger problems in terms of cash flow. And what the property developers need is for this trend to turn around. But as you can see, it's been in severely negative territory for the last 5 years. And if you extrapolate this chart over the next few years, it would mean that those property developers will be facing even tougher times ahead. And this chart shows the investment into the Chinese property market over the last 5 years. And what this shows is that since April 2022, investment in property has been falling. And this is for two reasons. Firstly, Chinese consumers have lost total confidence in the Chinese property market. Prior to the last couple of years, property was seen as being a no-risk gamble. You could buy property and it would always go up in price. So therefore, Chinese investors wanted to put as much money as they possibly could into the market because they knew they would make really good returns. However, as soon as prices started falling and property developers started collapsing, everybody got concerned, and there were horror stories about people who had full mortgages for properties that hadn't even been built yet. And as a result of all of those factors, confidence has now disappeared in the market. So Chinese consumers don't want to buy multiple properties any longer. They're not looking to invest into property. They'd rather hold their cash. And also investors into companies and the sector in general have also pulled out because of what's happening with companies like Evergrande, where they're going into liquidation. Everybody is trying to get out of property, and as a result of that, there has been a reduction in the amount of investment into the sector, and that's now becoming a vicious circle in terms of all of these developers who need to raise capital. And in the first 2 months of 2024, there has been a 9% reduction in total investment into the property sector. So the situation is getting worse, and it's going to take a miracle to be able to turn this around. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I've been talking about Evergrande for more than 2 years on this channel. It was one of the first series that I actually put together in terms of financial videos. So it's a company and a subject close to my heart. And we've been following the story over that period, and it's become an absolute nightmare. It started off as a company that looked like it had just taken on too much debt and was over leveraged. However, over the last 2 years, lots and lots of details and information have come out about the business. And these latest allegations that the company has fabricated $78 billion worth of sales are absolutely mind-blowing. And these allegations haven't come from some conspiracist. They're not coming from a news agency that's throwing mud at the company. They're coming from the largest regulator in China, a business that can go in and investigate businesses. That's what they do. That is the reason that they were set up. And the fact that they've announced this fine and these allegations must mean that they've got concrete evidence to prove that Evergrande was nowhere near as big a company as it said it was. And obviously, the reason that it raised $332 billion of debt was because of what it was showing in its accounts. It said it was doing fantastically well, it was hitting all of these turnover numbers and making huge amounts of profit. But as we talked about earlier in the video, in 2019, 50% of all of its sales were fabricated, and in 2020, that number was up to 79%. So more than 3/4 of the business didn't actually happen. So what that means from a debt perspective is that the company shouldn't have had anywhere near $330 billion worth of debt. So in terms of being able to recover all of that debt to be paid back, it's an absolute impossibility because this company was never as big as it said it was. And what we're going to see now is these investigations spreading across the whole sector. I am absolutely positive that the Chinese regulator is now investigating every single one of the major property developers in China. And if it discovers that this has been common practice, that all of these companies have been doing this, what we've got is massive fraud right across the sector. And it also means that these companies have been overinflating their numbers in order to access more debt. And that is now potentially criminal action. So we could see, firstly, a lot of companies going into liquidation. Secondly, a lot of companies failing to be able to repay their debts. So that's going to have a huge financial implication in China and also the rest of the world, because a lot of these companies did raise bonds overseas. And thirdly, it's likely that we could see a lot of criminal charges being brought against the finance guys and the founders of these businesses. And as we talked about earlier in today's video, China still has the death penalty, and it has actually used it for company fraud. So I'm sure a lot of these previously wealthy individuals will now be feeling very uncomfortable. And the other implication of today's video is that PricewaterhouseCoopers, the second largest accountancy firm in the world, is now in the spotlight. It signed off on those accounts. It said it was happy that those numbers were rock solid. That's what an auditor does. It gives you independent verification of what a company says it's doing. Somebody has to go in and get satisfied that the company has approached it in the right way and that there's evidence that all of those numbers were real. But what we're finding out is that those numbers were nowhere near real. They were 3/4 inflated. Now, obviously, from an auditor's point of view, somebody should have picked that up. Somebody should have asked the question in terms of the sales. Were they all genuine sales that had completed? Were any of them pre-sales? Are we talking about people who've made reservations for properties that haven't been built yet? Because if they had, then they shouldn't have been showing anywhere near the full amount of that. Maybe you can show the initial deposit, but you shouldn't be showing all of the figures. But that's what they did, and PricewaterhouseCoopers are now potentially liable and accountable for that. And what happened in the case of Enron, which was the largest fraud that we've seen in history so far, was that its auditors, Arthur Andersen, were also put under the spotlight. They were accused of being complicit in terms of what happened for Enron, and that business actually collapsed. Arthur Andersen no longer exists as an accountancy firm. It doesn't do audits anymore. And that could potentially happen to PricewaterhouseCoopers if it's found guilty and if it's also signed off on other companies in China, which there's a real possibility of. So we have got not just a fraud of Evergrande here, we've got a potential for the whole sector to be unfolding as potentially fraudulent. And there could be a whole host of accountancy firms that also become liable. And we could be seeing a whole lot of criminal charges being brought against lots of different people all across the board. Now, in terms of what the implications of all of this are for China and the Chinese economy, this has the potential to be absolutely huge. Because if it is uncovered that we've got widespread fraud and all these companies have been overstating their numbers, that means that they've got more debt than they'll be ever able to repay. And so we're facing huge losses, potentially in hundreds of billions, could even be into trillions, because we have got a massive amount of debt in this sector. So we're talking about record-breaking losses that have never been encountered before. This could have a cataclysmic impact on the Chinese finance sector. We could see banks becoming illiquid and going bankrupt if they have got these huge losses. Now, the Chinese state will obviously step in and try to support them, but this potentially could be a version of the global financial crisis happening in China. We could see an implosion of the financial system. Now, obviously, that would have huge negative knock-on impacts to the rest of the world, because China is the second largest economy by some way in the world. So if China goes into a major recession and a meltdown, it would have knock-on ramifications. It would likely cause a global recession, because China may stop buying things, and therefore lots of other businesses and countries would also suffer as a result of China being in dire straits. So the overall summary of today's video is that the allegations of fraud against Evergrande are obviously bad news for Evergrande and its founder. They're also bad news for the Chinese property sector, potentially really bad news for the Chinese economy, and maybe even really bad news for the global economy. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face. I've got some really exciting news for you. I've decided to give away another one of my statues, and this time it's this guy, the man on stilts. Now, if you've been watching my channel, you'll know that this is one of the original pieces that I've been showing in the background for the last few years. This is a truly amazing piece. I absolutely love it. And it's made by a British artist called Paul Moggetts, and he makes a limited number of each one of his pieces, and I've managed to secure a second one of these. But I'm giving this one away, which is the original one that I've had in the background for the last few years. And if you'd like to win it, you just need to buy a ticket in the raffle, which are priced at £1 each, which is around $1.30. So very affordable. So if you'd like to support the channel, rather than buying me a coffee or sending me a YouTube super thanks, why don't you buy a ticket in the raffle and you could have this in your home some point soon. Now, in terms of organising this, I've got an independent company to collect the cash and make the draw for me. So I won't be choosing it. It will be entirely at random. And I will post this anywhere in the world to whoever wins it. There is a possibility that you may need to pay a little bit of import duty depending on where you live and what the rules are. But I will send this anywhere. So if you'd like to win it, please buy a ticket in the raffle and good luck.